The first time I sensed something was deeply wrong in my marriage did not come with shouting or accusations, but with silence that felt heavier than any argument ever could, and it settled into the corners of our home like dust that no one bothered to clean anymore, collecting in places where warmth used to live. It was a late afternoon in early spring when my wife mentioned, almost absent-mindedly, that her firm was hosting an outdoor corporate gathering the following weekend, and she said it in the same tone someone uses when reminding another person to pick up groceries, as if my presence were a minor logistical detail rather than something she truly wanted. She barely looked up from her phone when she told me, and when I asked if she wanted me to meet her coworkers, she hesitated before saying, "It might be good for appearances," which felt less like an invitation and more like an obligation she was checking off a list. We had been married for nearly a decade by then, and though we shared a house, a routine, and years of history, the emotional closeness that once defined us had slowly dissolved into polite distance. She guarded her phone like it held state secrets, stepping into other rooms whenever a call came through, and she often changed the subject when I tried to talk about my day or ask about hers. There were no obvious betrayals, no smoking gun, just a pattern of subtle withdrawals that left me feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. And though I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, I could not shake the feeling that I was no longer truly part of her world. The day of the event arrived under a bright sky, and the office complex where her company operated looked more like a luxury hotel than a workplace, with glass walls, sleek landscaping, and a sprawling patio filled with decorated tables and catered food stations, all of it designed to impress. The moment we stepped through the gate, I noticed a shift in her body language that was impossible to ignore as she began walking ahead of me, quickening her pace in a way that created distance between us without ever saying a word. When coworkers approached, she introduced me simply as my husband, never mentioning my name, never offering context, never making it feel like I was part of her life rather than an accessory she had brought along for show. I stood there smiling politely as she transformed into someone else, laughing louder, standing straighter, and engaging with her colleagues in ways she rarely did with me anymore. Whenever I moved a few steps away to grab a drink or use the restroom, I saw her animated and lively, but when I returned, she became reserved again, as if my presence dulled her shine. The contrast stung, not because I needed validation from strangers, but because the person who once celebrated me now seemed determined to minimize me, and the realization crept in that she did not want me to belong in this part of her life at all. As the hours passed, I watched her carefully avoid any situation that might naturally involve me, drifting away whenever a coworker asked a question that could include both of us, or finding excuses to check her phone whenever I stepped closer. Conversations about hobbies, travel, and weekend plans unfolded all around us, yet I was never invited into them, as though my existence disrupted some carefully curated image she was trying to maintain. I felt invisible, like a guest at an event where everyone else had been given a script but I was left without a role, and it forced me to confront something painful about how she saw me. I ran a small but stable business, supported us through difficult times, and built something with my own hands, yet in her professional world, those accomplishments apparently held no value. Watching her engage so freely with others while keeping me at arm's length made it clear that this was not about shyness or stress, but about control and perception, and the longer I stood there pretending everything was fine, the more I realized how deeply I had been sidelined in her life. It was near the outdoor bar when I first noticed someone looking at me differently, not with polite detachment or social obligation, but with genuine curiosity. And when I turned, I saw a woman standing alone, observing me with an expression that felt refreshingly honest. She was dressed simply yet confidently, and there was an ease about her that made her stand out from the crowd, as though she belonged wherever she chose to be. She approached with a warm smile and introduced herself as the regional director of the company, and the way she spoke to me, with direct eye contact and a firm handshake, felt like a small but powerful contrast to how my wife had treated me all afternoon. She mentioned that she had heard about me but never met me, which surprised me, and when I asked what she meant, she laughed lightly and said that my wife spoke often about her work but rarely about her personal life, which made people curious. The conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on business, travel, and observations about workplace dynamics. And for the first time that day, I felt like myself again, relaxed and seen in a way that reminded me who I used to be before I started shrinking to fit someone else's expectations. After a while, her tone shifted, and she admitted that she had expected someone entirely different based on how my wife spoke about our life together. And when I asked her to explain, she hesitated, clearly realizing she had crossed a line. She confessed that my wife often vented at work, portraying our relationship as unfulfilling and mismatched, which had created an image of me that did not align with the person she was now talking to. Hearing that stung more than I expected, not because I cared what strangers thought, but because it confirmed a suspicion I had tried to ignore, that my wife was not just distant, but actively rewriting our story in a way that diminished me. When I looked across the patio and saw her laughing with coworkers, completely unaware of the conversation unfolding nearby, I felt a quiet shift inside me, as though something I had been holding together finally cracked. The director followed my gaze and remarked on my wife's ambition, suggesting that sometimes people lose sight of what truly matters when they become too focused on climbing the ladder. And though she spoke diplomatically, the implication was clear. She saw the imbalance, the disconnect, and the quiet power struggle playing out beneath the surface. And when she told me that my wife felt threatened by my independence rather than proud of it, something clicked into place. I realized that I was not being pushed away because I had failed, but because I had succeeded in ways she could not control, and the confidence that once drew her to me now made her feel overshadowed. The truth was uncomfortable, but it also felt strangely freeing, as if I had finally uncovered the real reason for the growing distance between us. When the director asked if I would like to meet for coffee sometime, her words hung in the air with unmistakable intent, and though I felt flattered, I was also grounded by the reality of my marriage. I explained that I was married and gestured toward my wife, and the surprise on her face spoke volumes. She admitted that my wife never acted like someone who was happily married, never spoke with pride or warmth about her partner, and the honesty in her tone made it impossible to dismiss. Before I could respond, my wife approached, her forced smile barely concealing the tension beneath, and when she saw who I was talking to, panic flickered across her face. The director mentioned the coffee invitation again, and my wife's reaction was immediate, revealing a possessiveness that felt ironic given how she had treated me all day. Once the director excused herself, my wife confronted me, accusing me of flirting, and for the first time in months, I did not shrink or apologize. I calmly pointed out how she had ignored and avoided me, how she had made me feel invisible, and how her anger only surfaced when someone else showed me respect. She tried to justify her behavior by citing workplace pressure and image, admitting that she felt I did not fit into the world she was trying to build for herself. And though she danced around the words, the message was clear. She was ashamed of me, not because of who I was, but because I did not align with the version of success she wanted to project, and hearing it spoken aloud stripped away any remaining illusions I had about our marriage. As I stood there, listening to her rationalize her embarrassment, I realized that the relationship I thought I was fighting to save had already ended long before that day, and the only thing left was the habit of staying. I told her I was done apologizing for being myself, done pretending that disrespect was normal, and when I walked back toward the director to accept her coffee invitation, it felt less like betrayal and more like reclaiming my sense of worth. The choice was not about starting something new, but about ending something that no longer honored who I was. And as I left the event, ignoring my wife's calls behind me, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief, knowing that for the first time in a long while, I was finally choosing myself. The night after I left that gathering, I barely slept, not because I doubted my decision, but because my mind kept replaying every moment that had led me there, every quiet dismissal, every withheld affection, every time I had convinced myself that patience was the same as loyalty, when in truth it had been fear of starting over. I stayed in a small guest room at my brother's place, staring at the ceiling while the weight of my new reality settled in, realizing that the marriage I had fought so hard to protect had been unraveling long before that day, and that what I felt now was not loss, but release from a role I was never meant to keep playing. My phone buzzed shortly before dawn with a message from the director confirming our meeting time, and instead of guilt, I felt clarity, as if a door I did not even know existed had finally been opened, allowing fresh air into a space that had grown stale and suffocating. I spent the morning reflecting on how easily people can mistake endurance for love, how we cling to familiarity even when it erodes our sense of self, and I promised myself that I would never again allow someone to define my worth based on how well I fit into their narrative of success. The first coffee meeting felt surprisingly natural, free of awkward tension or hidden agendas, and we talked for hours about everything from childhood memories to professional challenges, discovering that mutual respect creates a foundation far stronger than shared convenience. She listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about my business and celebrating my independence rather than viewing it as a threat. And for the first time in years, I felt encouraged instead of tolerated. Over the following weeks, those conversations became dinners, then long walks, then spontaneous trips that reminded me what it felt like to be chosen rather than managed. And the connection that formed was rooted not in competition or insecurity, but in admiration and trust. She never tried to reshape me into something I was not, and I never felt the need to shrink myself to make her comfortable, which made me realize just how much of myself I had been suppressing in my previous life. When the legal process of ending my marriage finally began, it was met with resistance at first, not from love, but from fear of losing control and the image she had worked so hard to construct. She tried to rewrite history, suddenly expressing appreciation for everything she once dismissed, but by then the truth had been spoken aloud, and it could not be unheard. I understood then that respect cannot be summoned when it becomes convenient, and that the absence of it is not something counseling or compromise can always fix. The separation was not dramatic, but it was definitive, and when the paperwork was complete, I felt lighter, as if I had been carrying someone else's expectations for far too long. Word eventually spread through her workplace about the incident, not because I sought revenge, but because people notice patterns when they are put on display, and the image she had carefully curated began to crack under the weight of her own actions. Meanwhile, my business flourished with new opportunities and partnerships, and the woman who had entered my life encouraged every step forward, celebrating my achievements as if they were her own. It was in those moments that I truly understood what partnership meant, not as a transaction, but as a shared journey where both people grow without competing for the spotlight. Months later, as we sat together watching the city lights from a quiet cafe, she told me she was considering a new place to live, somewhere with room for two people to build something meaningful, and the invitation felt like a promise rather than a proposal. I looked at her and saw not perfection, but authenticity, and in that honesty, I found a future that felt real instead of performative. We spoke about dreams, not as obligations but as possibilities, and for the first time, I envisioned a life that did not require me to justify my existence. Eventually, I heard that my former partner had transferred to another city, seeking a fresh start where the reminders would not follow her, and I wished her well without bitterness, knowing that growth often comes from discomfort. I did not feel victorious, only resolved, because the lesson I carried forward was not about winning, but about recognizing when to let go. Life, I realized, is too brief to spend with someone who views you as an accessory rather than a companion. One evening, as we walked through a bustling street filled with laughter and music, she turned to me and said that my authenticity was my greatest strength, not a flaw, and that it was something she admired deeply. Her words resonated because they echoed what I had finally learned to believe about myself, that worth is not measured by how well we conform, but by how honestly we live. In that moment, surrounded by strangers who did not know our story, I felt more at home than I ever had in the house I once shared. Our relationship was not built on contrast or rebellion, but on mutual respect and shared values, and the happiness we found was quiet yet profound, grounded in everyday moments that reminded me why I had chosen to step away from a life that no longer served me. We planned our future with intention, not urgency, savoring the freedom that came from choosing each other without fear or compromise. Looking back, I understood that the gathering where everything unraveled was not a betrayal, but a revelation, a moment that forced me to see what I had been avoiding, and though it was painful, it was also necessary. It taught me that self-worth is not something others grant us, but something we must claim for ourselves, even when it means walking away from what once felt secure. Now, as I move forward, I carry with me the knowledge that love should never feel like a performance, and that the right partner does not make you smaller, but encourages you to stand fully in who you are. The journey that began with quiet doubt ended with clarity, and in choosing authenticity over approval, I found a life that finally feels like my own.